Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we set sail across wine-dark seas, through storms and sirens, forgotten islands and ancient gods. We're diving into the entire story of the Odyssey, an epic of longing and survival, of cleverness and curses, and a man who simply wanted to go home. As always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you? Whether you're lying in bed, watching the moon drift by, or curling up with a warm drink in the quiet dark, this is your time to rest. This is a story thousands of years old, passed from voice to voice beneath the stars. And tonight, it's all yours. The city burned for days. Smoke coiled into the morning sky in heavy black columns, rising like omens toward the indifferent heavens. And the scent of charred stone and scorched flesh clung to every breath drawn within 100 leagues of Ilion. It had once been proud, a city of towering walls and gilded towers that gleamed under the Anatolian sun. Its high citadel home to kings who had held off 1,000 Greek ships for 10 long and bitter years. But no stone lasts forever, and no wall, however tall, can keep out deceit when it wears the skin of a gift. The wooden horse had been their ruin, pulled within the gates with songs and cheers. It stood silently in the city's heart, as hollow as the promises that came with it. Inside, 30 of the best warriors the Achaeans could muster, waited like vipers in a basket, swords drawn and breath held, until night cloaked the city and the Trojans lay drunken and dreaming. Then the killing began, and when dawn returned, it rose not over Troy, but over its ruins. Among the ashes walked Odysseus of Ithaca, son of Laertes, known across the isles not for the strength of his sword arm, but for the sharpness of his mind. He had not cheered when the horse was pulled through the gates, though it had been his idea, nor did he raise his voice in triumph as the palaces fell one by one, their marble columns groaning like trees in a storm before crashing to earth. There was no joy in what he saw. He moved through the wreckage like a man haunted, his sandaled feet crunching over the remnants of a civilization that had stood longer than any man's memory. He saw corpses half buried in rubble, men burned in their armor, women sprawled with their eyes open to the sky, and children curled in corners where even gods might hesitate to tread. Victory had come, yes, but it had come like winter after harvest, stripping everything away and leaving only cold behind. The Trojans were gone, their city broken, and the Greeks had won a war no one would forget, but there was nothing left to fight for. There is something strange about the end of a war. It is not a moment, not a single instant, when all swords are sheathed and peace descends like a soft blanket. It is a slow and uneven thing, a quieting of the blood, a fading of the cries, a growing awareness that all the anger and agony that once seemed to matter so deeply have become distant echoes. For Odysseus, the war had been too long. He had left Ithaca with black curls still on his shoulders, with a young son clinging to his wife's leg, and the promise that the gods would see him through. Now he was older, leaner, tempered like iron in the forge of war, and he had seen what lay at the end of glory. The other kings would sail home with their gold and their songs, but Odysseus felt no fire in his chest. He thought only of Penelope, her quiet eyes and patient hands, and of Telemachus, a child he had left behind who might now be a man. Archaeologists would later dig into the earth of northwestern Turkey and find the bones of Troy buried under centuries of silence. They would find crumbled walls, scorched stone, arrowheads lodged in collapsed gates, and ash layered so deep it told a story as clearly as any bard. They would call it Troy 8 and say it matched the dates of Homer's songs, that there had been a real city and perhaps even a real war. But in this moment there were no historians, only the victors and the dead, and among them a tired king with salt at his temples and shadows in his heart turned his eyes to the sea. The wind called softly, carrying the smell of blood and fire away from the shore. It was time to go. Odysseus gathered his men, what was left of them. Ships rocked gently in the shallows, their black sails limp, their timbers groaning like tired beasts. There were no cheers as they boarded, no songs, just the silent rhythm of feet on planks and the groaning of oars as they set out once more into the open sea. Behind them, Troy smouldered. Ahead, the vast and unknowable sea stretched like a dark promise. No one knew the journey that lay ahead, least of all Odysseus, and the gods, watching from their thrones atop Olympus, began to whisper. The sea was calm when they left Troy. It stretched out before them in a mirror of silver and ash, still smeared with the smoke of the smouldering city behind. The ships rowed slowly at first, oars dipping into the tide with a soft rhythm that seemed almost reverent. There was no laughter on the decks, no jubilant songs. The Greeks had expected triumph to taste sweet, but the ashes of Ilion clung to their tongues. For 10 years they had fought, and now, with Troy finally fallen, they sailed not as victors returning home, but as men hollowed by time and sacrifice. The war had taken from them more than comrades and youth. It had taken their certainty. What lay before them now was not peace, but the unknown, for no man can spend a decade at war and return unchanged. Odysseus stood at the prow of his black ship, one hand on the rail, the other wrapped in the folds of his dark cloak. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, though there was nothing to see but the faint shimmer where sky met water. His thoughts drifted toward Ithaca, the craggy island of his birth, with its olive trees and goat-strewn hills, the smell of thyme and salt in the wind, and the white stones of the palace where Penelope waited, if she still waited. In his mind he could see her on the terrace, weaving by lamplight, her fingers deft and tireless, though perhaps now streaked with age. Telemachus, the boy he had left swaddled in linen, would be nearly a man by now. Would he know his father, or had time erased him like a chalk mark on stone? The men rode on, their arms moving with the muscle memory of soldiers long accustomed to hardship. The creak of the oars and the soft lap of water were the only sounds. Some stared blankly into the sea, others whispered prayers to the gods or kissed small tokens around their necks, charms from wives, from mothers, from children left behind. Each one dreamed of home, but none knew the path. The Aegean was a fickle place, and the gods more so. Some had already begun to quarrel among themselves, dividing the spoils of favour and punishment. What had been a united effort under the banner of war was now dissolving into suspicion and pride. Agamemnon would return to Mycenae with his great haul of treasure and a cursed woman at his side. Menelaus would wander longer than he expected, though his brother had promised him swift return. But it was Odysseus who drew the gaze of Poseidon, though he did not yet know it. The sea god watched him from beneath the waves, brooding like a storm not yet risen. Odysseus, the clever one, the builder of traps, the speaker of lies, had played a role in the fall of Troy that no god could ignore. Some admired his cunning, some despised it, but Poseidon remembered. For a time, the god held his hand, letting the ships glide over gentle swells under favorable winds, but that peace was only a pause. The sea is never still for long. Even the weather seemed hesitant, as if the world itself waited to see what course the returning Greeks would take. Stars appeared above them at night, wheeling slowly in familiar constellations, but their patterns felt changed, just slightly, as though the heavens had shifted while men slaughtered one another on Trojan shores. The winds came soft and slow, warm as breath, yet behind them always lay the threat of something colder, something darker. Odysseus spoke little during those early days. He gave commands with quiet clarity, but his thoughts were far away. He knew better than most that their voyage would not be simple. Too many eyes had watched Troy burn. Too many gods had taken sides. The road home, if it could be called a road, would be carved not by oars or sails alone, but by fate and will and sorrow. The men trusted him, though some whispered that the gods had marked him. They were not wrong. And so they sailed on, past the capes and islands that framed the coast of Anatolia, slipping into deeper water where the horizon widened and the currents grew less familiar. Every morning brought a new sky and a new risk. There were no maps for what lay ahead, only stories. Old tales of islands that moved, of winds that could tear ships apart in seconds, of sirens who sang sailors to their doom. The men had laughed at those stories once. They did not laugh now. Odysseus stood alone at night beneath the stars, listening to the wind and waiting for the next trial. The war was over, but the journey had only just begun. The sea grew restless after Troy, as though it too had wearied of war. Winds shifted without warning, and the tide began to turn against them. The sails swelled one day and fell slack the next, and the men grew silent, uneasy. When the black ships reached the coast of Thrace, they were tired, hungry, and already losing the discipline they had clung to during the long campaign. They came upon the city of Ismarus, a stronghold of the Cyclones, nestled on the edge of fertile land between hills and sea. The slopes around it were green and rolling, the wine-coloured waters lapping gently against a pebble beach. It seemed a place too peaceful for warriors to touch, but peace was a word the Greeks had long forgotten. They had spent a decade taking what they needed by fire and blade. Why should now be any different? Odysseus did not command them to land, but he did not stop them either. And so they did what they had done in so many other cities. They came ashore at dawn, swords drawn and torches in hand. The Cyclones were taken by surprise, the morning still clinging to mist, and their guards still half in sleep. The Greeks fell upon them like wolves. They slaughtered the men who stood in defence, chased the women through the narrow streets, broke open storehouses, and stripped temples of their treasures. They feasted on stolen meat, drank stolen wine, and cheered as they dragged gold and slaves down to the shore. It was not the first time these men had taken a city. It would not be the last. And yet, There was something different in the air at Ismarus. Something heavy. Something watching. Odysseus urged them to take what they needed and leave before the gods turned their eyes upon them again. He had seen what pride and delay could bring. He had watched it burn Troy to the ground. But the men did not listen. Drunk on victory and wine, they wanted one more night to revel. They had lost too many comrades. They had won too few spoils. They laughed at caution and wrapped their arms around captive women. They lit fires and sang songs into the dusk, believing that the sea would wait for them, that the land would stay still beneath their feet. It did not. At first light, the Cicones returned, not scattered and broken, but organized, armed, and reinforced by tribes from inland. The hills spilled over with warriors. Bronze flashed in the rising sun. The battle was sudden and merciless. The Greeks, still heavy with wine and sleep, scrambled to form ranks on the beach. Arrows rained down from the ridges. Spears cut through the surf. The fight was short, brutal, and without glory. Men who had faced Trojans for a decade now died in the sand at the hands of simple herdsmen and farmers. The tide that had once carried them to glory now threatened to carry them away in disgrace. Odysseus fought like a man possessed. He rallied the survivors, pulled his captains into line, and ordered a retreat to the ships. Shields rose, oars dropped, and with blood on their hands and curses in their ears, they rowed away from Ismarus, leaving behind the bodies of their dead. 6 men from each ship had fallen, and their names were never carved in stone or sung by poets. Their graves were the shallows, their epitaphs the silence that followed. When they were far enough from shore to see the smoke of their fires, mingling with the new flames of the returning Cicones, Odysseus sat on the deck and looked back without expression. There was no victory in his heart, only the cold certainty that they had brought this on themselves, that they had been warned, that the gods did not forget. Ismarus was not a punishment. It was a reminder. The war might be over, but the rules of blood and consequence still held. Behind him, the men were quiet again. They tended wounds, whispered prayers, and did not meet each other's eyes. Whatever had burned in them after Troy had dimmed, the world was wide, the sea was deep, and the road to Ithaca was far longer than they had dared imagine. And somewhere in the shifting blue, the gods were beginning to stir. The sea turned strange in the days that followed. The winds blew in odd patterns, not with the fury of storms, but with a dreamlike slowness that carried the ships farther south than any man aboard could chart. The stars shifted overhead, and the current seemed to flow against memory itself. No gulls cried, no dolphins followed in their wake. The men rowed in silence, each stroke of the oars more like a ritual than a task, as if they rowed through time rather than water. The sun burned pale and high, offering neither warmth nor clarity, and the men began to lose track of the hours. Odysseus, ever vigilant, stood at the tiller, frowning into the distance. He felt it in his bones. The change. It was not a storm on the horizon, but something quieter, more dangerous, a soft forgetting. When the land finally appeared, it did so without warning. A low-lying coast, pale as bone, with groves of strange trees growing close to the shore. No towers, no walls, no smoke rising from hearth fires, just a hush, as though the island itself slept and dreamed. Odysseus gave the order to anchor near the shallows. The water was clear and still, and the sand beneath the hull shimmered like polished glass. He chose 3 men to scout, gave them careful instructions, and watched them wade ashore. They vanished into the foliage like leaves caught in windless air. Hours passed. The sun barely moved. When the scouts did not return, Odysseus began to fear that they had met with some hidden danger. He armed himself and took a few of his best men inland, following the trail of crushed grass and broken twigs. The forest was silent, but not unfriendly. Strange birds sat on low branches and watched without cawing. The trees bore fruit Odysseus had never seen before, round and golden, hanging low on delicate stems. The air smelled of honey and sleep. They found the scouts by a pool of still water, reclining in the shade like men in a dream. Their eyes were half-lidded, their limbs slack, their faces lit by the kind of gentle bliss that only comes to the dying or the mad. They smiled when they saw Odysseus, but made no effort to rise. One of them offered a handful of soft yellow fruit. His voice was slow and peaceful, as if each word was a warm stone dropped in a quiet stream. He told Odysseus of the people who lived nearby, the lotus eaters, and how they had welcomed the strangers like kin, offering them food and comfort and a place among their own. The fruit, he said, was their gift, the heart of their way of life. It was not food but forgetting. One bite and sorrow became distant. One bite and the war was gone, and the long road to Ithaca meant nothing at all. Odysseus looked into their eyes and saw the truth of it. They had eaten the fruit, and it had stripped from them every tie to home and memory. They would not fight, they would not flee, they would not even ask to stay. They simply were. He felt a chill crawl beneath his armor. It was not a poison in the usual sense. It did not kill the body, but it killed the will, and that was worse. Without another word, Odysseus seized the first man by the tunic and dragged him from the grass. The others began to protest, but he shouted them down with the voice of a king and a father. His men obeyed him. They bound the dreamers with rope and carried them back to the beach, though the scouts wept and begged to stay, calling the fruit by names that sounded like lullabies. The sailors, waiting at the ships, stared in confusion as their comrades were thrown aboard like cargo. Only when Odysseus gave the order to raise the sails did they see the look in his eyes, the tightness in his jaw, and they obeyed without question. The wind returned just as the anchors were drawn, as if the sea itself had waited for them to choose. As the island faded behind them, Odysseus stood at the stern, watching the shoreline vanish into mist. He said nothing. The bound men wept for what they had lost, not understanding that it had never been theirs to keep. It was not evil that dwelled on that island, but something softer, a kindness too deep, a peace without roots. The lotus eaters had no need for war or glory or longing, but neither did they remember their own names. That night, as the sea rolled beneath the hull and the stars blinked above like the eyes of old gods, Odysseus kept watch. He did not sleep. He thought of Penelope and the child he had not seen in 20 years. He thought of the graves of his friends and the shipwrecks still to come. He thought of the fruit, and how easy it would be to taste it. One bite, and it would all go quiet. The sea, the gods, the pain. But he did not bite. He clenched his fists until his nails dug into his palms, and he whispered the name of his home until it no longer sounded like a prayer, but like a sword. They sailed westward after the Lotus Island. The wind sullen and heavy, as though the sea itself disapproved of their escape from forgetfulness. The men were subdued, their thoughts turned inward. No one spoke of the golden fruit or the dreams it had offered. They sat on benches, eyes dimmed, shoulders hunched against the sunlight, and rowed as if each stroke might carry them further from something they could no longer name. Odysseus remained watchful, his hands firm on the tiller, his thoughts like a fire burning behind his eyes. He knew their journey had entered a new kind of danger, not just of storms or swordplay, but of slow erosion. Each trial left its mark. Each shore offered a different kind of death. When land came into view once more, it rose like a jagged tooth from the sea. The coastline was steep and craggy, with cliffs that fell sheer into the surf. No harbours welcomed them. No smoke curled from chimneys. The hills were bare and rough, and behind them loomed a higher ridge covered in scrub and stunted trees. They sailed along the shore until they came upon a small inlet, a half-moon cove guarded by rock and reef, with fresh water flowing from a spring and a meadow thick with grass and wild goats. It seemed a good place to rest, to mend sails and restock provisions. Odysseus gave the order to land. They hauled the ship ashore and gathered wood for fires. The men hunted easily among the hills, slaying goats and feasting well for the first time in many days. Their spirits lifted, but Odysseus's gaze kept drifting inland. From the ridge above, he had seen something strange. A large cave set into the cliffside like the mouth of a slumbering beast, and near it, strange pens made of stacked stone and timber. Sheep grazed freely nearby, unafraid of men or fire. There were signs of habitation, but no roads, no cultivated fields, no ships or harbours. It was a land untouched by trade or war, a quiet, isolated place. Odysseus, curious and cautious, chose 12 men and set out inland at dawn. He told the others to guard the ship and wait for his return. He took with him a skin of potent wine, a gift once given by a priest of Apollo, in gratitude for mercy shown during the sacking of his town. It was a wine so strong it had to be diluted 20 parts to 1, and even then it could drop a man in his tracks. Odysseus had kept it close all this time, a secret weapon in a world ruled by force and favour. The land grew stranger as they climbed. There were no signs of plough or road. The air was thick with the scent of animals and damp stone. The cave loomed larger with every step, and when they reached it, they found it half shaded by overhanging rock and marked by the soot of ancient fires. Inside were great clay jars of milk and cheese, racks of drying meat, and baskets of sheep dung, neatly swept. Everything was huge. The tools were crude, but enormous, the shelves chest high to a grown man. The sheep themselves were larger than any they had seen, thick of wool and placid-eyed. The men grew uneasy, sensing that whatever dwelled here was no common shepherd, but the hunger in their bellies and the thrill of discovery pushed caution aside. They lit a fire, cut slices of cheese, and waited for the owner to return. He came at dusk. The sound of his footfalls alone froze the blood in their veins. Stones shifted beneath him like pebbles. The sheep came in first, docile and bleating. Then the silhouette of the giant filled the cave mouth. He stood as tall as the roof, broad as two oxen yoked together. His face was brutish and uneven, but it was the single eye in the center of his forehead that held them transfixed. One eye, wide and black, gleaming with dull intelligence. He moved slowly, deliberately, sealing the cave with a great slab of stone that took all his strength to roll into place. Then he turned to the firelight and saw them. There was no talk of hospitality, no questions, no greetings. The Cyclops, for that was what he was, a child of the old gods and the deep earth, reached down and seized two men before the others could rise. He dashed their skulls against the stone and devoured them raw, bone and all, blood running down his chin like wine. The Greeks screamed and scattered into the shadows, but there was nowhere to run. The stone blocked the entrance. They were trapped in the lair of a monster older than memory, and the only thing between them and death was the wit of their captain. Odysseus said nothing that night. He watched the giant sleep, his belly round and slick with gore, snoring like a volcano. Odysseus turned the plan over in his mind, piece by careful piece. There was no fighting this creature. No spear or blade would pierce that hide. He would have to be tricked. At dawn, when the Cyclops stirred and began his morning routine, milking the sheep and making his breakfast of another unfortunate Greek, Odysseus stepped forward. He brought the wine. He bowed low and offered it with both hands, speaking in the tones of a humble wanderer. The Cyclops, curious, drank. He liked the taste and asked for more. Odysseus gave it 3 times. The giant's words began to slur. His breath grew heavy and his eye began to close. Before the giant slumped into his drunken stupor, he asked the name of the clever stranger. Odysseus smiled with cold cunning and replied, "My name is Nobody." The monster laughed and promised to eat nobody last. When the Cyclops had collapsed into wine-sodden sleep, Odysseus gathered his men and showed them the sharpened stake he had carved from a piece of green olive wood. They heated it in the fire until it glowed red. Then, with all their strength, they drove it into the single sleeping eye of the Cyclops. The sound was like a wet tree splitting. The creature screamed, thrashing and howling. Tearing the air with his pain, the cave shook. Blood and smoke poured from the ruined socket. He clawed at the air, calling for help from the other Cyclopes who dwelled in the hills nearby. They came, calling through the stone, asking what had happened. The blinded giant cried out, "Nobody has hurt me. Nobody is killing me." The others, hearing this, cursed him for his drunkenness and left him to his suffering. Odysseus and his men waited through the night as the Cyclops raged and roared, groping blindly for them. They dared not sleep. At dawn, when the giant rolled aside the stone to let the sheep out to graze, Odysseus tied his men beneath the bellies of the largest rams. He clung beneath the biggest of all, silent as breath. The blinded Cyclops stood in the mouth of the cave, running his hands over the backs of the animals as they passed, feeling for men. He found none. The Greeks slipped past him, clinging to wool, and once they were outside, they cut themselves free and ran to the ship. As they pushed off from the shore, Odysseus stood at the stern and shouted back to the cliffs. He could not help himself. Pride rose in him like a tide, and he cried out his true name. I am Odysseus of Ithaca. It was I who blinded you, monster. Tell your father it was I. Tell Poseidon. The Cyclops roared, lifting his arms to the sky, and called upon the god of the sea, his father, to curse this man who had stolen his sight. And far below the waves, something ancient stirred. The ship pulled away from the shore as fast as oars could churn water. The men rowed with the desperation of men who had looked death in the eye and found it half blind but still grasping. The cliffs of the Cyclops Island loomed behind them, grey and jagged, lit by the pale light of morning. Smoke still curled from the cave mouth, and the howls of the blinded giant echoed faintly across the waves. The men said nothing. Their hands were bloodied from gripping the ropes that had bound them beneath sheep. Their backs ached, their legs were raw, but they were alive, and that was enough, for a moment. Then Odysseus stood at the stern. The wind was behind them, and the sails were beginning to fill, the ship easing into a smoother rhythm, the danger left behind. He turned his eyes to the shore, to the black mouth of the cave that had swallowed and nearly destroyed them, and he raised his voice. He shouted not a farewell, but a name, his own name. A name that had once carried weight among kings. I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca. Tell your father who blinded you. Tell him who outwitted you. Tell him who made you howl. The men froze. Oars slipped. Eyes turned toward their captain in disbelief. It was as though he had tossed a stone into still water, and they were all watching the ripples spread. For a moment, all was quiet. The cliffs stood tall. The waves lapped softly against the hull. The sheep bleated somewhere in the hills. Then the roar came. A voice like the cracking of mountains, thick with agony and rage, rising from the island and striking the sea like a hammer. The Cyclops had heard, and he had called upon his father. Poseidon, Earth-shaker, lord of the sea, brother of Zeus and Hades, god of salt and storm and vengeance. The sea that had moments before been smooth and quiet began to shiver. The winds twisted. Clouds gathered where there had been none. The very water seemed to breathe, inhaling deeply beneath the hull. The sky turned the colour of iron. And every man aboard that ship knew, with the cold certainty that settles in the belly like stone, that the sea would never be safe again. Poseidon heard his son's curse. He listened to the words spoken by Polyphemus through shattered teeth and bloodied lips. The god did not speak in reply. He did not need to. The answer came in the turning of the tide, in the sudden pitch of the ship, in the pull of forces unseen. It came in the tightening of Odysseus's jaw, in the way his eyes searched the horizon for storms that had not yet formed but would. He knew what he had done. His pride had struck a deeper wound than the stake driven into the Cyclops' eye. He had declared himself to the gods. And gods do not forget. That night they found no safe harbour. The winds drove them south and east, then back west again, as if the sea itself could not decide where to send them. Stars were hidden behind veils of cloud. The moon shone like a knife's edge, before vanishing altogether. The men clung to the sides of the ship and whispered prayers to gods who would not answer. Some wept, some cursed, but all of them turned their eyes again and again to Odysseus. It was he who had brought them to Troy, he who had led them out of the Cyclops' cave, and now it was he who had spoken too loudly, who had drawn the wrath of a god who ruled the very waters beneath them. Odysseus did not sleep. He stood at the stern with one hand wrapped around the tiller and the other clutching the cloak around his shoulders. His face was unreadable, carved from the same stone as the cliffs they had escaped. He said nothing, but inside him the fire of shame burned hotter than the pride that had sparked it. He had outwitted a monster, but he had forgotten that monsters have fathers, and fathers, especially divine ones, have long memories and endless reach. As the sun rose behind veils of mist, they saw the sea calm once more, but it was a silence that promised nothing. It was not peace, it was not mercy, it was the breath before a storm. And Odysseus, though still far from home, knew in his bones that he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The sea would rise against him again and again, not because he had sinned in ignorance, but because he had spoken his name in triumph, and the gods, above all else, do not suffer mortals who forget their place. The sea gave them no rest, only brief moments of mercy. The days that followed the curse of Poseidon were grim and restless, the men's eyes sunken and shoulders hunched from sleepless nights. Each morning brought uncertainty. Each evening carried the scent of dread. The wind did not howl, but whispered in strange voices, shifting direction with a cunning malice that could not be charted. The stars, above, no longer seemed to hold meaning. The constellations twisted, unfamiliar in shape and place, and the moon vanished more than it showed its face. Odysseus stood at the helm through much of it, hands blistered from rope and salt, eyes fixed not on the sea before him but on something deeper. He was not simply navigating the waves, he was navigating the will of gods, and that was a far crueler current. It was on the 12th day, after they fled the island of the Cyclopes, that they came upon a place unlike any other they had seen. The island rose from the sea in smooth green swells, and its cliffs were capped with towers that shimmered not with marble, but with polished bronze that gleamed like fire under the sun. The shoreline was calm, the harbour gentle, and the scent of the air was not salt and decay, but cedar and spice. The men exhaled as if they had been holding their breath for days. Even the sea seemed to ease beneath the ship as they sailed toward it, as if it too bowed to the strange power that lived there. This was the floating isle of Aeolia, home to the Keeper of the Winds. The halls of Aeolus were carved into a cliffside and polished until the stone shone like pearl. The king himself was no warrior or priest, but a god-appointed warden, a man granted the stewardship of the winds by the will of Zeus himself. His palace thrummed with air that shifted and stirred without source, and the voices of his children echoed in the halls like birdsong. Aeolus received Odysseus with the courtesy of an old ally, though they had never met. He had heard of the sack of Troy, of course. The world had heard of it, and he recognized in Odysseus not just a veteran of that long war, but something else, something older and more cunning. They feasted in the high hall for a full month, eating and drinking beneath painted ceilings while the wind circled outside like wolves waiting for the gates to open. Aeolus listened to Odysseus, Recount the tale of the journey thus far, the fall of Troy, the raid on the Cicones, the cursed fruit of the lotus eaters, the horror of the Cyclops. He said little in reply, but his face darkened as the story unfolded, as though he could hear in the thread of Odysseus's voice the low murmur of divine wrath that had begun to haunt the man's every step. When the tale was finished, Aeolus made a gift. It was not gold or weaponry. It was a thing both more simple and more powerful. He took a great ox-hide bag, and into it he sealed all the winds that might oppose Odysseus. He bound it tight with silver cord and told him that so long as he kept the bag shut, no storm would touch them. Only the gentle west wind remained outside the bag to carry them safely home. Ithaca lay just beyond the edge of the world now. If he sailed well and the gods looked kindly, he could reach it in 10 days. Odysseus took the gift and bowed low, grateful beyond words. They set out the next morning, the sea calm and the sky clear. The ships moved swiftly, the west wind filling the sails like the breath of Athena herself. The men sang again. They laughed. They wept in secret joy. The coastline of unknown lands fell behind them, and the promise of home shone before them like a lantern. Odysseus did not sleep, not at first. He kept the bag close, lashed to the mast with a cord no man could undo without cutting. The men asked what treasure lay within, but he said only that it was a gift for the gods, nothing more. But days passed, and sleep stole upon him. When they were near enough to Ithaca to see its pale cliffs through the morning haze, the island a whisper on the horizon, Odysseus allowed himself rest. His eyes closed, and with them the door to caution. The crew had waited. Their curiosity, once quiet, had grown into suspicion. The bag was never opened. Odysseus guarded it like gold. They spoke in hushed voices. Surely it was treasure he meant to keep for himself. Perhaps stolen wealth. Perhaps the spoils of Troy. Perhaps enough to buy 10 kingdoms and live like a god. In the still hours of the night, when Odysseus lay in a dream of Penelope's arms and Telemachus's voice, 2 men crept to the mast and slit the cords with a dagger. The bag opened with a groan, and the winds screamed as they were released. The ship lurched, the sky blackened, the sea rose with a fury it had not shown in weeks. Waves crashed over the deck, the sails snapped and tore. The men screamed as they were thrown from their benches. Odysseus woke to a sky in chaos and a ship tumbling backwards through space and time. Ithaca vanished like a ghost. The winds drove them in circles. Days passed. The horizon stretched. Their hope unraveled. When they finally reached the Isle of Aeolia once more, battered and hungry, Odysseus climbed the hill alone. He carried the empty bag in his arms like a dead child. Aeolus met him at the gate and saw the truth before a word was spoken. He shook his head and stepped back. "The gods," he said, "have turned against you. I cannot help a man cursed by heaven. Leave this place. Do not return." And so they sailed again into open water, the winds unbound, the gods silent, and the memory of home, a flame flickering just beyond reach. Odysseus stood at the bow, hands empty, eyes grim. There would be no more gifts, only trials. And the sea, restless now, would carry them toward another shore, where death waited in another form. The sea is a patient beast. It does not need to roar to kill. It can lull you with calm and promise, and still bring your ruin before you draw your next breath. After they left Aeolia for the second time, with the wind snarling once again through the rigging and the gods turned cold in their silence. Odysseus and his men found themselves adrift, not in storm, but in stillness. The sky hung low and grey, the waves moved with a quiet that was neither peace nor favour, only absence. It was the quiet of the moment before a blade is drawn. Days passed, the food stores grew light, the water went stale. The men no longer asked questions or whispered about the gods. Their prayers had become private things, muttered to the wood beneath their feet or the sky above their heads, words not meant to be heard aloud. Then came land, a coastline that curled like a claw into the sea, steep and shadowed by cliffs that seemed to scrape the belly of the clouds. The harbour was narrow and deep, the water inside dark and strangely calm, as if the sea had stopped breathing. There were no fishing boats, no smoke from chimneys, no sign of pasture or road, but there was a scent on the air, faint and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. Still, the men were tired, and the place seemed a refuge after so many long days adrift. Odysseus gave the order to lower the sails. The ships glided into the harbour, one by one, their hulls rocking gently on the dark tide. All but one. Odysseus, cautious where others grew eager, held his own ship back. He had seen too much, lost too much, to trust still water and steep hills. He chose a handful of men and sent them ashore. They climbed the narrow path that led up the cliff, the rocks slick beneath their sandals, their weapons drawn not in challenge, but in wariness. At the summit they found what passed for a city, though it was no polis of stone and bronze. The houses were crude, carved into the hillsides, or raised from piled boulders. The air was thick with a stench of blood and smoke. And then they saw her, a girl at a well, tall and pale, with a pitcher in her hands and a gaze that did not seem to notice them until she turned and ran. She vanished between the houses, and the men, puzzled, followed. They should not have. For what came next was not welcome, but ambush. The girl had fetched not her father, but her king, and the king was not a man, as men are known, but a giant, broad as a warhorse and twice as tall. His skin was the colour of granite, and his eyes burned with a hunger that knew neither mercy nor hesitation. He stepped from behind the stones and seized one of the sailors before the others could cry out. The man screamed only once, before the giant broke his spine across a knee and hurled his body against the wall. Blood painted the rocks. The others turned to run, but it was already too late. For these were not men who merely ruled by strength. They were the Laestrygonians, an ancient tribe of cannibals, older than cities, older perhaps than gods, and their hunger was not for land or gold, but for flesh. The narrow harbour below had become a trap. As the scouts fled back down the cliff shouting warnings, the giants came. They poured from their stone houses like bears from a cave, hurling rocks the size of oxen onto the ships below. The cliffs gave them the high ground, and from it they rained death. One by one, the ships were smashed against the harbour walls. Sailors dove into the sea, only to be speared from the shore, or seized from the waves and torn apart with hands like claws. The water turned red. The screams echoed like the howling of dogs in a storm. Only Odysseus, whose ship had stayed outside the cove, escaped the slaughter. He had seen the first boulder strike, had heard the sound of bones breaking against timber, and he had given the command to row, hard and fast, before the second ship had even begun to burn. His oarsmen did not question. They pulled with all the strength their fear could give them, and the black ship turned and fled, cutting through the water like a knife. Behind them the harbour filled with fire and blood, and above it all the giants roared in triumph, their mouths wet with the remnants of men. When at last the sea hid the cursed shore from view, Odysseus looked out over what remained. One ship, one crew, 11 vessels, lost. Hundreds of men, friends, kinsmen, warriors who had survived 10 years of war, now devoured in a single morning. The deck was silent but for the soft weeping of those too tired to scream. No one spoke of revenge. No one asked for justice. They had seen monsters before. They had escaped gods and curses and storms. But this was different. This was not myth or punishment. This was hunger, raw and real, and it had stripped them of everything but the will to survive. Odysseus stood alone at the prow that night. He did not speak. He did not weep. He listened to the sea and the wind, and he watched the stars return one by one. He counted the dead by the weight in his chest, and when the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky, he turned his face away from it. The gods had taken much, but they had left him one thing still, his journey, and he would see it through. The sea did not speak, but it watched. After the massacre at Telepolis, after the screams had faded and the cliffs of the Laestrygonians vanished behind them, like a nightmare swallowed by fog, the survivors sailed on in silence. Only one ship remained now. One hull held the remnants of an army that had crossed half the world and survived the fire of Troy. The men moved like ghosts across the deck, their skin tight against bone, their eyes sunk in hollow sockets. The wind moaned in the rigging, and the timbers creaked beneath their feet, and the sound was more alive than they were. Even Odysseus, who had weathered every horror with iron will, now stood alone at the prow, like a statue carved from old grief. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He watched the horizon with the quiet of a man who expects nothing and fears everything. It was the sea that chose their course, not any hand upon the rudder. Days passed in a haze of hunger and dread, until at last they saw land rising out of the mists, like something half remembered from a tale told in childhood. The island of Aea lay before them, low and green, ringed with forests of oak and cedar, and crowned with smoky hills. The shoreline was gentle, the harbour wide and still. Birds wheeled overhead, and the air was rich with the scent of life. It looked like no place of danger, but after Telepolis, the men no longer trusted their eyes. They beached the ship and stepped onto the sand with the caution of soldiers entering a battlefield. No drums beat, no spears were raised, but danger, they had learned, often wore a beautiful face. They camped on the shore, built fires with driftwood, and hunted for food among the hills. They found deer and boar in abundance, and soon the fires were crackling with roasting meat. The men began to speak again, their voices raw with the effort, and laughter came haltingly, like a bird learning to fly again after a long winter. Still, Odysseus held back. He did not trust ease. He watched the smoke curl into the sky and thought of the gods, of Poseidon's wrath, and the long road still ahead. The island was too quiet, too clean. It had not been touched by war or ruin, and that in itself was strange. On the third day, Odysseus sent out a scouting party. He chose 20 men and placed their command in the hands of Eurylochus, his most cautious lieutenant. They followed a winding path into the hills, past streams that whispered over stone and trees that swayed without wind. The birds did not flee from them. The animals did not startle. It was as though the island did not fear men, and perhaps it did not need to, for in the clearing at the top of a hill stood a house unlike any they had seen before, built of polished stone and roofed with copper. It gleamed in the sunlight like a jewel left upon velvet. From within came the sound of singing, a woman's voice, low and sweet, weaving strange words into the air. The men hesitated. Eurylochus urged caution, but others, hungrier and bolder, stepped forward. They knocked, the door opened, and there stood Circe. She was beautiful. That much the stories would later remember. But beauty alone cannot explain what held them in place. It was the calm in her eyes, the stillness of her face, the way she looked at them as if she had already seen their entire lives laid bare like scrolls unrolled at her feet. She smiled and beckoned them inside. Her hall was warm and filled with light. There was food on the tables and wine that glowed red as garnet in golden cups. The men entered, one by one. Only Eurylochus stayed behind. He watched the door close and heard their laughter rise within. He waited, and when they did not return, he fled. He came back to the ship, pale and shaking. His words tumbled over each other, but the truth was plain enough. The men had vanished. The woman was no woman at all, or if she was something older and crueler besides. Odysseus did not hesitate. He girded his sword, slung his shield across his back, and started toward the house on the hill. He walked alone, the wind lifting his cloak behind him like wings, and the earth seemed to watch him pass. On the path, he was met by a stranger, young, bright-eyed, and cloaked in the shape of a mortal man, but Odysseus knew better. Hermes, the messenger of Olympus, stood before him. The god spoke quickly, offering both warning and aid. The woman was Circe, daughter of Helios, sister of witches, a weaver of dark spells. She had turned his men into animals, pigs that wandered her pens and ate from her hand. But there was hope. Hermes drew from his robes a single stalk of a black-stemmed flower, its petals pale as snow. Moly, he called it, a gift against her magic. Take it, he said, and you will not fall to her charm. Odysseus thanked him and walked on. When he reached her door, he knocked once and entered. The hall was just as Eurylochus had said, warm and glowing, heavy with perfume and the scent of meat. Circe sat at the head of the table, her eyes curious, her smile unreadable. She offered him a drink, and he took it. Her hands stirred it with a silver wand. Her lips whispered words no man should hear. Then she gave it to him. He drank, and nothing happened. She stepped forward to strike him with her wand, but Odysseus drew his sword. The blade sang through the air and stopped at her throat. Circe froze. For a moment, all time stopped with her. Then she laughed, not with mockery, but with something like relief. "You are not like the others," she said. And Odysseus, breathing hard, lowered his sword. She swore no harm would come to him. She kissed his hand and offered peace. The spell was broken. The men were restored, but nothing, from that moment on, would be as it was. Circe kept her word. The men who had been pigs once more walked on two legs. They stumbled from her pens dazed and blinking, their minds slowly returning as though pulled from deep water. They had not known they were beasts. Their thoughts had been fog and instinct, but now the fog had lifted, and the shame came with it. They remembered the laughter in her hall, the sweet taste of wine, the warmth of her gaze. They remembered trust. That was the cruelest part. Circe stood before them and asked for forgiveness, and though her eyes were clear and her words soft, none could say whether the sorrow in her voice was true or merely well practiced. Still, Odysseus did not strike her. He sheathed his sword and accepted her welcome. Perhaps he had seen too much cruelty to recognize it when it wore a kindly face. Or perhaps he knew that sometimes even monsters grow weary of being monsters. She led them to her hall and gave them food and beds and songs in the evening light. Her servants moved like shadows, women with silent steps and downcast eyes, and the house itself seemed to breathe around them. The walls were hung with fine tapestries, the floor paved in coloured stone, and the air was heavy with the perfume of strange herbs and flowers that bloomed only on that island. The nights were warm and filled with voices, and for the first time in many months the men laughed without bitterness. They laid down their swords. They washed the blood from their skin and let their wounds heal. And so the days became weeks, and the weeks months, and still they did not leave. Circe was more than a sorceress. She was a goddess in her own right, born of a line older than Olympus, touched by fire and star and ocean. Her voice could still a man's heart or drive it mad. But she was also lonely. In Odysseus she found not just a warrior but a mind sharp enough to match her own. They spoke in long hours under torchlight of the stars and the dead, of the gods and the silence between their names. She poured him wine and asked no questions he would not answer. He spoke of Ithaca sometimes, but less often than before. She listened, she smiled. When he touched her, she did not flinch, and he stayed. His men called it a blessing. They ate their fill. They slept in soft beds. They forgot the fear of drowning, the taste of hunger, the cries of their dying friends. The ship lay on the beach, gathering moss. The oars were stacked like firewood. The sails folded and dry. Odysseus walked the hills with Circe by his side and watched the seasons begin to shift. They spoke of old songs and ancient cities and the shadows that live beneath the waves. There was no talk of war, no prayers to Poseidon. The curse seemed distant, as if it had been left behind on some other island under a different sky. But the gods do not forget, nor do they forgive without reason, and dreams, however sweet, cannot last forever. One evening, as the sun bled into the sea and the hills turned to bronze, Odysseus stood alone on a cliff and looked westward. Ithaca lay somewhere beyond the horizon, a shape in memory more than a place. He could still see Penelope's face in the firelight. He could still hear Telemachus calling to him, but their voices had grown quieter, faint as wind across stone. He felt the weight of time upon his shoulders and knew he had lingered too long. The gods had given him a moment of peace, and he had turned it into a year. Circe knew it too. That night, she said nothing as he paced the halls. She only watched him, and in the morning, she met him with a solemn face and told him the way forward. It was not through any sea he had yet crossed, but into the land of the dead. There, she said, he must go, to the edge of the world, to the place where the river ocean circles the earth and the shadows of men wander forever. There he must seek Tiresias, the blind prophet of Thebes, whose soul still remembers what the living have forgotten. Only Tiresias can tell him how to reach Ithaca through the curse of Poseidon. Only the dead can speak to one who walks the road between home and ruin. Odysseus did not argue. He nodded. She gave him the rites, the signs, the sacred blood and the black ram to carry. She told him the words to speak and the names to remember. Her voice did not tremble, but when he turned to leave, her hand lingered on his arm, just a moment too long. The next day, they prepared the ship. The men worked in silence. The spell was broken. The island that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a memory waiting to fade. Circe stood on the shore and watched them go. She said nothing more, only lifted one hand in farewell, and as the ship slipped away into the darkening sea, her figure grew smaller, until even the goddess looked like just another woman left behind by war. The sea turned colder as they sailed into the far reaches of the world, where no sun warmed the water and no stars dared linger long in the sky. The wind came not from the west or the east, but from the very bones of the earth, and it carried the scent of ash and salt and forgotten things. The men no longer spoke of Ithaca. They no longer whispered of gods or curses. They rowed without song, their faces pale with the knowledge that they were sailing not toward a land of men, but toward the edge of death itself. Odysseus stood alone at the prow, the cloak of Circe wrapped tightly about his shoulders, his eyes locked upon the horizon that grew darker with every passing hour. He did not look back. He had said all that could be said. He had taken the rites, the sacrificial beasts, the wine and the barley, and he had carried with him the instructions of the enchantress who knew the names of stars and the scent of spells. There was no courage in him, only duty. Only the long, weary march of a man who has outlived every good reason to go on and must now walk the road of shadow to find what lies at the end of it. At last they reached the place. The river ocean, black and endless, curled around the rim of the world like a serpent, sleeping with one eye open. The waters did not ripple. They moved with the silence of ancient thought, and the trees that grew along its banks were grey with age and leafless as bones. There was no bird song, no insects hummed, only the low moan of the wind through hollow branches and the soft slap of water against the hull. Odysseus gave the command to stop. They beached the ship upon the shore of the land that was not land, and he stepped down into the cold earth with the slow reverence of a man entering a tomb that has waited centuries for its guest. He drew his sword and began the rites. The pit was dug in silence, a square of black earth carved into the flesh of the world. Around it he poured the libations, honey and wine and water, sacred barley and the blood of the black ram, its throat cut clean, its life spilling into the earth with a hiss that seemed too loud in that cursed stillness. The men stood behind him, their eyes wide, their mouths dry. They clutched their cloaks tight and dared not breathe too deeply, for already the air was changing, already the darkness was moving. They came in silence, the dead, pale shapes that drifted out of the shadows like smoke made flesh, drawn to the scent of blood, to the memory of breath. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths open as if to speak, but no words came. They surrounded the pit, hands reaching, heads bowed, crowding in with the hunger of centuries. Odysseus stood over the hole with sword in hand, guarding the offering. He called out into the gloom, his voice low and steady, asking for Tiresias, the blind prophet, son of Evarus, the one who knew the paths that even the gods kept hidden. But it was not Tiresias who came first. One by one the shades passed before him, faces he had known, names carved into his memory. He saw Elpenor, the youngest of his crew, the boy who had drunk too deeply in Circe's hall and fallen from the roof in his stupor, neck broken like a twig. Elpenor pleaded with him, not for justice, not for revenge, but for burial. "Do not leave me unburned," he said. "Do not let my soul wander without peace. Build me a mound, set my oar upon it." Odysseus promised. He took the boy's name into his heart and sent him back into the gloom with that small comfort. Then another shade rose, a woman, tall and noble and quiet, his mother, Anticlea, dead before he could return, dead without the knowledge of his survival. Her eyes were filled with something too deep for words, not sorrow, not anger, something older. The silence of all the mothers who have waited and watched and grown still. She spoke of Ithaca, of Penelope who still waited with her loom and her grief, of Telemachus who had grown from child to man without a father's voice to guide him. She spoke of the suitors, of the vultures gathering in his home, feasting on his absence, and Odysseus wept. Not the tears of a warrior, not the tears of a king, but the tears of a man who had forgotten how much had been lost behind him while he marched endlessly forward. He reached to hold her, but she slipped through his arms like wind through reeds. The dead do not embrace, they remember. And then, at last, Tiresias came. The prophet was tall and lean, and though his eyes were closed in death, his face was full of sight. He stood at the edge of the pit and drank the blood, and his lips moved with ancient speech. He told Odysseus what he needed to hear, not what he wanted, not what he hoped. The way home would be long, still, and full of pain. The wrath of Poseidon was not spent. The sea would not forgive. He warned of Thrinacia, the island of the sun, where sacred cattle graze that no man must touch. He spoke of Scylla and Charybdis, of sirens and storms. He told of the bow and the axe, of the house filled with wolves in human shape. And at the end of all things, he spoke of a death far from the sea, a gentle death, a quiet death, after peace had been earned and the world had forgotten his name. That would be his reward. That would be his rest. The wind rose then, the river groaned. The dead began to stir, drawn closer by the scent of life. Their hands reached for him, their mouths gaped wider. Odysseus stepped back, sword raised. He ordered his men to retreat, and together they fled the pit, leaving the dark to itself, the blood to sink into the soil of that haunted shore. They ran to the ship and cast off, and the sea took them back with open arms, colder than before, but familiar now. The world of the living closed around them like a cloak, heavy and full of burden. Odysseus did not speak. He sat at the stern and stared at the horizon, and behind his eyes marched the shades of the dead. The prophet's voice still echoed in his skull, and the smell of blood would not wash from his hands. The journey would go on. The gods had demanded it, but something had changed in him now. He had walked among the dead and looked them in the eyes. He had felt the weight of his absence, the truth of time, and though his ship moved forward, something in him had begun to turn back. The sea greeted them once more, not with fury, but with silence. It stretched in every direction, endless and cold, a grey plain beneath a sky that never seemed to change. The wind whispered through the sails, but it carried no joy, no promise of home. Odysseus sat at the prow like a man carved from driftwood, his eyes hard with memory and the weight of prophecy. The voice of Tiresias still clung to his thoughts like cobwebs in a tomb. There would be no easy passage. The trials to come would not test his sword, but his restraint, his wisdom, and the resolve of the broken men who still followed him. He knew now that their suffering was not the cost of failure, but the price of return. Home was no longer something to be won in battle. It was something to be endured toward. As they sailed from the black shore where the dead had whispered and wept, Circe's island appeared again on the horizon, distant and faint as a fading dream. They made landfall, only long enough to bury Elpenor, as promised, building a mound of stones above the surf and placing the young man's oar upright in the earth, like a monument to everything they had lost. Odysseus said few words, but they were heard all the same. The sea listened, the gods listened, and perhaps even the soul of the boy, drifting on whatever wind carried the dead, paused to hear them say his name one last time. Circe met them at the shore, her eyes heavy with knowledge she had long carried alone. She said nothing of what she had seen in his face, but she spoke instead of what lay ahead. There were dangers that had no name, creatures born not of the gods, but of the spaces between their breath. She drew maps with a stick in the sand and whispered old warnings while the surf hissed around her. There would be sirens ahead, voices sharp as bone and sweet as honey, whose song lured men not with lust, but with longing, not the body's desire, but the soul's thirst for secrets it was never meant to know. No man who heard their song ever turned back. They leapt from their ships willingly, hands outstretched to nothing, smiles on their lips as they sank. So Odysseus prepared. He ordered wax melted and pressed into the ears of every man aboard. He alone remained unguarded, lashed upright to the mast with ropes knotted until his arms bled. He told his men that no matter what he said, or screamed, or begged, they were not to release him. The ship glided onward into still water, and soon the air thickened. There was no land, no birds, only the slow swirl of mist and the sudden swell of a voice that did not echo, because it filled every space at once. It was not one voice, but many. Not one song, but all songs. It spoke of home, of mothers waiting at the hearth, of lovers with hands outstretched, of children with eyes that knew his name. Odysseus screamed, he wept, he begged, he tore at the ropes until the skin peeled from his wrists, and still the men rowed forward with empty eyes and ears sealed by wax. The sirens came into view at last, their shapes pale and beautiful and terrible, perched on rocks that gleamed with the bones of dreamers. They sang until the very sea trembled beneath them, and then, when the ship passed out of reach, they fell silent all at once. The silence struck like a bell. The spell broke. Odysseus collapsed against the mast and did not speak again until the island was lost in the mist. But the sea was not finished. The song had been only a prelude. Circe had warned him next of a strait, narrow, and cruel, where no ship passed unscathed. On one side loomed Scylla, the eater of men, a creature of nightmare, with 6 long necks and mouths ringed with teeth like spears. On the other side churned Charybdis, a maelstrom of living hunger that drank the sea and spat it back out with a fury that could tear the sky. The channel between them was no wider than a sling's cast. There was no path, that did not bleed. One could choose the storm or the fangs, the depths or the teeth. Odysseus chose Scylla. He told the men nothing of what they faced. There was no use in fear when it could do nothing but steal the strength from their hands. He ordered them to row hard and steady. He gripped the tiller himself and turned the ship toward the cliffs where Scylla lurked, hidden among the rocks like a spider watching its web. The water turned black. The wind screamed low and constant, and the sky narrowed until it seemed they were sailing through a throat. Then she struck. There was no warning, no cry, no growl. Only the sudden whip of those terrible necks and the jaws that snapped like thunder. 6 men were gone in the time it takes to draw breath. Lifted from the deck, screaming, flailing, swallowed into the mist above. Their swords clattered uselessly on the boards. Their names vanished into foam. The rest could only row, teeth clenched, hearts frozen, as the ship lurched forward, splinters flying from the hull, the sea roaring in every direction. Charybdis yawned to their left, and the ocean fell away beneath them, revealing a throat of whirling black. But the current pulled them clear just before it could close. The whirlpool collapsed with a sound like the earth cracking. Spray drenched the ship. The men gasped like men reborn. They did not cheer. They did not weep. They kept rowing. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, it was pale and distant. Odysseus counted the oars and saw the empty benches. He remembered each name. He would remember all of them. The sea did not care. The sea had no memory, but he carried their stories like stones, heavier with each mile. And still, Ithaca waited. The sea grew gentler after the strait. The sky cleared. The sun rose higher and lingered longer. The waves no longer threatened but swelled and dipped with a rhythm that lulled the men into silence. It was not peace. Not truly. It was the silence that follows a scream. The stillness after a wound has been dealt and before the blood has finished spilling. The men said little. They worked in quiet rhythm, their eyes sunburned and hollow, their limbs gaunt. They were fewer now. Each empty bench on the ship stood as a marker of someone lost. There was no need to speak the names. The memory of each scream still rang in the planks beneath their feet. Odysseus did not rest. He kept to the prow, watching the horizon with a gaze that never blinked for long. The knowledge given by Tiresias and Circe still pressed against his chest, like a stone hung from his neck. They had warned him of one place above all others, an island sacred to Helios, the god of the sun, where the cattle of heaven grazed in eternal light. Golden beasts untouched by time or mortal hand, tended and watched by divine eyes. The punishment for harming them would be swift and absolute. No plea would be heard. No god would intervene. The sun himself had made it clear. The cattle were sacred. To kill one would be to strike at the sky. But men are weak, and hunger is crueler than any sword. As they sailed, a wind rose, a harsh one, wild and steady, that drove them off course. No matter how tightly Odysseus gripped the rudder, the gods were steering now, not kindly, not blindly, but with intention. They were pushed toward the island they had been told to avoid. They circled it, trying to find a way past, but the storm would not let them go. With each attempt, the sea grew higher, the waves more violent. At last, with their provisions low and the men muttering in open fear, Odysseus relented. They anchored in the bay, where the water shimmered with unnatural stillness, and the land glowed under a sun that did not set. The cattle grazed in meadows of green and gold, their horns ivory white, their eyes calm. They were perfect, untouched, eternal. Odysseus gathered his crew and made them swear. He told them what the prophet had said. He repeated the words of Circe. He looked each man in the eyes and said that death would follow any hand that touched the cattle. They nodded. They murmured oaths. They swore on their lives and the lives of those they had lost. And for a time they obeyed. But time is an enemy, when the belly groans and the sky will not clear. The wind would not lift. Days passed, then weeks. The storm above the island raged without rain, without thunder, only wind and hunger and silence. Their food ran out. They fished and hunted what they could, but the island seemed cursed to deny them. Birds flew high and out of reach. The trees bore fruit too bitter to eat. The very air felt heavy, as if the god who ruled it was watching and waiting for them to break. And at last, they did. It happened when Odysseus had wandered inland, seeking solitude or perhaps one last word from the gods. In his absence, Eurylochus, ever silver-tongued and sullen, stood before the others and offered his argument. Better to die at sea for disobedience than to starve like animals beneath the open sky. What kind of god would condemn men to suffer for want of meat, while plenty stood in the field before them? These were not mortal beasts, they were sacred. Their flesh, perhaps, would not rot. Their meat, perhaps, would save them. It was not defiance, he claimed, it was necessity. And so they killed. They chose the finest cattle, the golden ones with broad backs and calm eyes. They built a fire. They offered prayers. They made it a ritual. But it was a lie. A thin veil draped over a crime already known to the heavens. The smell of roasting meat drifted across the island, up into the sky, where the chariot of the sun paused in its path. The god Helios saw what had been done. He turned his face toward Olympus and demanded justice. If Zeus did not punish them, he said, then he would cast his light into the underworld and leave the world in darkness forever. The gods heard. They nodded. The sentence was passed. Odysseus returned to the scent of cooking flesh and the laughter of men drunk on false hope. He knew at once what they had done. His rage was quiet, his words few. There was no point in shouting at the doomed. The oaths had been broken. The curse had been claimed. All that remained now was to see how it would fall. And it would fall soon. They sailed again under a sky that had forgotten how to be kind. The storm that had clung to the island like a living shroud lifted the moment the ship pulled from shore, as if the winds had only been waiting for the crime to be complete. The sea opened before them, wide and calm, but there was something wrong in its stillness. The clouds moved too slowly, the air was heavy and still, and even the gulls that once circled overhead had vanished. The sun, high above, burned too brightly. It did not warm, it scorched. There was no joy in the wind, only silence, and in the silence Odysseus could feel the gods watching. Not all of them, only one. Helios. The sun god's wrath was not loud. It was patient. Divine punishment did not need to shout. It waited until the men had begun to hope again, until they dared to speak of Ithaca once more, dared to imagine the hearth and the hall and the sound of familiar voices greeting them at the shore. They sang soft songs. They laughed. They looked to the horizon and called it beautiful. They believed, for a moment, that the curse had passed them by, that the gods were as tired as they were. But Odysseus did not join them. He sat alone beneath the mast, hands folded, eyes dark. He knew better. He had seen the pattern of divine cruelty. He had learned that the gods did not forget. They simply waited for the right moment to teach their lessons. And when that moment came, it came with thunder. The sky cracked open like a skull. The clouds, once white and soft, turned black as charcoal and swirled into a storm that seemed to have no center. The waves rose in silence, then crashed all at once, tall as mountains and fast as arrows. The wind screamed, the sea boiled, lightning split the mast in two and set the sail ablaze. The ship bucked like a wounded beast. The oars snapped in their locks. The deck tore itself apart beneath the men's feet. One by one they were thrown into the water, swallowed by the sea that had always waited to reclaim them. They did not scream long. They did not rise again. Odysseus clung to a spar, the wreckage of his ship torn loose and drifting like bones in a battlefield. All around him the sea howled, 1,000 waves crashing against one another, voices shrieking without tongues. The storm did not pass quickly. It did not relent. It lingered, dragging him across the surface of the world, spinning him through darkness and foam and the distant roar of a god who had been disrespected. The heavens raged. The sea answered. There was no salvation, only survival. And even that was cruel. At last, when the ship had been shattered into so many pieces it could no longer be called a ship, when the men had all vanished beneath the surface and their names were swallowed by the deep, the storm relented. The waves softened. The sky opened. The sea returned to its usual calm, as if nothing had happened, as if the violence had been only a passing fit of weather. Only Odysseus remained, alone, clinging to a broken timber, drifting with the tide like driftwood, too stubborn to sink. He floated for days. Time lost meaning. The sun beat down without pity. Salt dried in his eyes and on his lips. His skin blistered. Hunger gnawed at him. Sleep came in shivers and waking dreams. He saw their faces again. Eurylochus, Perimedes, the boys from Ithaca, who had once laughed at his stories by firelight, now nothing more than foam and memory. He spoke their names to the sea, but the sea gave him no answer. It had taken what it was owed. But the gods had not finished with him. There was still one more island, one more test, one more chapter before the tale could rest. For now, Odysseus drifted alone beneath a sky too bright and a sea too wide, a man not yet dead and not quite alive, carried by the current toward a fate he could no longer see but could still feel, like the cold breath of something waiting just beyond the edge of sleep. He drifted for 9 days and 9 nights, though the number meant nothing to a man who had lost his ship, his crew, and his sense of time. The sun rose and fell, but he no longer watched it. He clung to the wreckage by instinct, more than will, half blinded by salt and burned by sky. The waves bore him as they would bear any corpse, cradled by the deep and swayed by winds he could no longer feel. He passed through rain and heat, silence and storm, seeing only flashes of memory between the long blinks of his dry, cracked eyelids. There was Penelope, weaving alone at her loom in the great hall of Ithaca. There was Telemachus, walking the shores of their island, calling out for a father whose name had become a question. There were his men, smiling in the sun before Troy, whole and proud and still believing in home. The images faded one by one like breath-fogging glass, until only the weight of his own breath remained. He did not pray. He had forgotten the words. It was the sea that chose to spare him, or perhaps it was a god, though none stepped forward to take the credit. On the 10th day, his shattered body washed ashore on the island of Ogygia, a place untouched by war or time, hidden in the folds of the world where no map could reach. The sand was pale and soft. The trees hung heavy with fruit. Vines spilled down the cliffs in ribbons of green. Birds sang songs that no soldier had ever heard. The air was thick with the scent of flowers blooming out of season. There were no bones here, no screams, no ruins, only the endless hum of a paradise that did not need to remember the names of men. And there she found him, Calypso, a daughter of the gods, born of the sea and twilight, old as rain but shaped like a girl in bloom. Her hair was the colour of dark wine, her voice slower than sleep, her eyes unreadable. She stood over his broken body with neither pity nor scorn, only the stillness of one who has seen too many lost things wash up at her feet. She took him in her arms and carried him to her cave, a hollow of stone draped in ivy and light, filled with warm pools and sweet smoke. She washed the salt from his skin. She wrapped him in linen. She laid him on a bed of moss and let the wind lull him into dreamless rest. For 7 days and 7 nights he did not wake. When he opened his eyes at last, he saw her face and thought he had died. But she only smiled and said, "No, you are not dead, though perhaps you wish you were." In time, he regained his strength, slowly, like an old tree remembering how to bloom. His muscles stopped trembling. His breath grew steady. He ate the fruit of her trees and drank water from springs so clear he could see the sky reflected in every drop. His skin healed. The pain left his bones, but something deeper did not mend. He would sit at the mouth of her cave each morning and watch the sea as if it still owed him something. Calypso would bring him food and song, but he did not eat much, and he did not sing. When she asked what he sought in the waves, he said only, "Ithaca." And though she did not flinch, her eyes darkened. She offered him more than rest. She offered him a place beside her, a life of ease without war or sorrow, a deathless existence in the arms of an immortal who could keep him young forever. No pain, no aging, no gods, no kings. Just the two of them, alone on an island that never changed. She told him he was loved. She told him he had suffered enough. She told him that the world of men had nothing left to give him. And perhaps she was right. Perhaps the gods had no more mercy to offer. Perhaps Penelope was dead, or worse, remarried. Perhaps Telemachus had forgotten his name. Perhaps Ithaca no longer waited, but still Odysseus said no. Each morning he sat upon the same rock, staring west, not because he hoped, not because he believed, but because he could not bear to stop. He had survived too much to surrender now. Even in paradise, his heart beat for a home that might not exist. Calypso said nothing more. She watched him like one watches a fire burn low, knowing it will go out, but unable to look away. She did not rage. She did not beg. She waited. and somewhere high above, where Olympus pierced the clouds and the gods spoke in murmurs that shook the earth, the name of Odysseus was spoken again, and at last someone listened. Far above the gentle lapping waves of Ogygia, beyond the clouds and the winds and the reach of mortal breath, the halls of Olympus shimmered in gold and firelight. There, beneath ceilings that gleamed like hammered bronze and columns carved from the bones of the world, the gods watched the mortal world in silence. Some laughed, some schemed. Most had already forgotten the name of Odysseus. It had been years, years since Troy burned, years since ships splintered on foreign shores, years since men who once stood proud among heroes had turned to salt and silence beneath the waves. But gods, though they do not age as mortals do, grow bored, and boredom in their realm was dangerous. It meant they looked down again. They remembered their games. They spoke names they had not spoken in an age. And when Odysseus's name rose among them again, it did not go unheard. Athena had not forgotten. The grey-eyed goddess, daughter of wisdom and war, had watched him in silence as he wandered from isle to isle, bleeding and burning and losing piece after piece of the man he once was. She had pleaded often on his behalf, but Zeus, father of gods and holder of storms, had waited. He called it balance. He called it punishment. He claimed to honor Poseidon's rage, for the sea god had not yet forgiven the man who blinded his son, and laughed while fleeing the cliffs of the Cyclopes. But now Athena stood once more in the great hall, a spear in hand, her voice low and sharp. She spoke of Ithaca, of a queen waiting in shadows, and a son growing into manhood in the absence of his father. She spoke of a mortal who had been broken and battered and yet had not yielded. She said it was time. Zeus, who had once thrown mountains and set cities alight for less, nodded at last. Perhaps he was moved. Perhaps he was tired. Perhaps he simply missed the sound of his own justice. He turned to Hermes, the swift-footed messenger, and gave the order that would ripple down from Olympus and stir the world of men once more. "Go to Ogygia," he said. "Go to the nymph. Tell Calypso that the mortal she holds must be let go. Not tomorrow, not someday, now. The order cannot be refused. The time has come." Hermes obeyed. With wings upon his feet and a cloak woven from dawnlight, he flew from the heights of Olympus and crossed the world in the span of a breath. He descended through clouds thick as sheep's wool, through wind and rain and sudden silence, until the island of Ogygia appeared below him like a green jewel set in silver. He landed in the grove that circled her cave, where trees bore fruit in every season and the air never changed. Calypso saw him coming. She was waiting. She met him at the threshold, her face calm, her eyes dark as the deep. She offered him food, as was custom, and wine that tasted of memory. But Hermes did not sit. He did not drink. He unrolled the scroll bound in gold and read aloud the words that had been carved by thunder. She is to let the mortal go. He is to build a raft. She is to help him. She is to say farewell. The cave grew colder as he spoke. The light dimmed. Calypso stood very still. She asked no questions. She shed no tears, but her jaw was clenched and her hands curled at her sides. When Hermes left, she did not watch him go. She turned instead to the sea and stood there for a long time, listening to the waves, as if they might offer a reason for her sorrow. They offered none. The gods had spoken. The game would continue. When she returned to the cave, Odysseus was waiting. He had seen the winged god. He had felt the shift in the air. He asked her nothing. She answered with silence. Then, slowly, she told him what must be done. She would give him tools. She would give him wood. She would give him a cloak to guard against the sea and a wind to speed his passage. But she would not give him blessing, not because she did not love him, but because she did. He thanked her, and she smiled in a way that made him look away. For days he worked. He cut trees and shaped timbers. He lashed them with ropes and sealed them with pitch. She helped him, never speaking of what came next. The raft took shape, and the sky remained still. On the morning he set sail, she gave him a satchel of bread and a water skin and a cloak of woven moonlight. She kissed him once, not gently, not desperately, only once. And then he was gone. She stood on the shore, long after the sea had swallowed the last of the raft's sail, alone again, immortal still, a prisoner of paradise, left to walk the same soft paths and sleep beneath the same quiet stars, waiting for the next wave to bring another broken soul to her door. The raft moved slowly across the open sea, a frail skeleton of timber lashed together by hope and desperation. It creaked with every swell, its ropes groaning like old men in their sleep, but it held. It floated, and for a time the sea was kind, not generous, not warm, but kind enough to spare him a cruel death. The wind, sent by Calypso's whispered breath, filled the square of cloth he used for a sail and pushed him forward, ever westward, toward the memory of home. Odysseus stood with hands blistered by rope and eyes bleached by sunlight. There was no shelter, no shade, only sky and salt, and a thirst that no water could truly quench. He ate the bread slowly, drank the water in silence, and slept beneath the stars, waking often with a sword of dread pressed against his ribs. It was not the sea that frightened him. It was what waited beneath it. For Poseidon had returned. The god of the sea had wandered far in the days of Odysseus's drifting. He had been feasting among the Ethiopians, casting storms across distant oceans and ignoring the quiet pleas of Athena and the commands of his brother Zeus. But when he returned and saw the mortal hero, the same cunning Ithacan who had blinded his son Polyphemus, gliding across his waters once more, a rage woke in him that split the sky. He rose from the depths in a chariot of foam, his beard dripping with kelp, his eyes black with the weight of every drowned sailor who had ever begged for mercy. He did not roar, he did not curse. He simply raised his trident and called to the sea. The waves answered. First came a wind that turned against Odysseus, like a hound biting its master's hand. Then a squall, sharp and sudden, that tore the sail from the raft and flung it into the sky like a scrap of cloth. The water grew teeth. It rose in walls. It broke over him, again and again, dragging the raft down, spinning it like a leaf in a storm. The timbers cracked. The lashings snapped. The raft was no longer a vessel. It was driftwood once again, and he with it. Poseidon watched from afar, unmoved. A god cannot be denied his vengeance. Odysseus clung to what he could. A single beam, slick with brine and blood, kept him from sinking. The sea tried to drag him under, pulling at his legs, filling his mouth with salt and silence. For 2 days and nights he floated, a speck in a world of water, watched by gulls and gods alike. His arms grew numb, his eyes blurred. He sang no prayers, he made no bargains. He he simply endured. It might have ended there, had it not been for the mercy of another. From the sea rose a woman not of flesh, but of foam and wind, and the gleam of fish scales in moonlight. Leucothea, the white goddess, once mortal, now something stranger. She saw him, broken and near death, and took pity. She rose beside him and offered a veil, woven from sea silk and memory, telling him it would keep him afloat. He must cast off his cloak, his pride, even the broken raft, and trust only the gift she gave. He hesitated, but she was gone before he could refuse. Only the veil remained, and the memory of her voice. He let go. He wrapped the veil around his chest and cast himself into the waves. The sea pulled him under, but he rose again. It tried to silence his breath, but he clung to life with the stubbornness of old kings and dying stars. For days he drifted, his body stripped of strength, his mind walking the edges of madness. And at last, the sea grew bored. Poseidon, satisfied or simply distracted, let the winds die. The current turned, and the shore of Scheria came into view. Green hills rolled beyond white sand. Tall cliffs stood like watchmen at the edge of the sea. Trees bent in the breeze, and the sound of birdsong broke the long silence that had followed him across the world. He crawled onto the beach like a man reborn from the ocean's womb. His hands dug into the wet sand as if to test that it was real. He kissed the earth, not as a man returns home, but as a ghost touches life for the first time in centuries. He was alone, but he had survived. Again. The sand clung to him like a second skin, and his limbs were slow to obey. He had come ashore with nothing, not even the strength to weep. For a while he lay at the border where the sea met the land, where each wave reached out to drag him back, only to retreat before the decision could be made. But the tide did not claim him. The gods had taken enough, and for now they were still. When the sun rose, it cast its light across the coast of Scheria, and the land revealed itself as green and wide and welcoming, a place untouched by war and forgotten by wrath. Odysseus pulled himself up the slope with the care of a man who has known too many betrayals. He moved slowly into the shelter of the woods, found a bed of leaves beneath a pair of olive trees that leaned together like old friends, and at last gave in to sleep, dreamless and deep. It was not the gods who found him there, but a girl. Nausicaa, daughter of King Alcinoüs and Queen Arete, had come to the river's edge with her handmaidens to wash garments and laugh beneath the morning sun. She was young and proud, her skin golden with youth, her voice full of the music that lives only in people who have never had reason to fear the future. When the girl's laughter rang out across the valley, it woke Odysseus. He rose from the underbrush like a beast broken loose from a net, salt-streaked and half-naked, his beard matted, his eyes wild. The girl shrieked and scattered, but Nausicaa stood her ground. She did not run. Her breath caught in her throat, but her feet did not move. There was something in him that made the gods lean closer when he spoke. She saw not the wreck he appeared to be, but the shadow of something older and stronger, a man who had endured and could endure again. Odysseus spoke carefully, weaving his words as if they were cloth he had not touched in years. He asked for help, not in command but in humility. He praised her beauty with the practiced tongue of a king who knew the weight of flattery when tempered with truth. She listened, and though she knew nothing of his name or deeds, she offered him kindness. She gave him garments from the wagon, oil to wash with, food to still the fire in his gut. She told him to come to her father's palace, but not with her. Appear at the gates alone, she said, and fall at the feet of my mother. Win her favor, and you will win us all. It was a queen, not a king, who held power in the court of the Phaeacians. So he waited, and then followed, dressed now in linen and dignity, though his feet still bled. The city rose before him like something from a dream carved in marble and copper, with towers that gleamed in the sun and walls smooth as polished ivory. He walked through its gates unnoticed, guided by Athena, cloaked in a mist that kept the eyes of men from marking him. He reached the great hall, found Arete upon her throne, and knelt before her as Nausicaa had advised. The queen looked down on him with a gaze sharpened by rule and softened by time. She saw the wear in his skin, the wound in his voice, and she listened. Odysseus did not name himself, not yet, but he told a story of storms and strange lands, of gods who blessed and cursed, of a man who longed for home more than for comfort. The king and queen offered him food and drink, and the mist of anonymity was gently peeled away. As he ate among them, the court stirred with whispers. He carried himself like a prince. His speech had the weight of command and sorrow. This was no vagabond, no castaway. This was a man of purpose, a guest of fate. Alcinous, a king of peace and ships, stood and asked plainly whether this stranger wished to be taken home. The Phaeacians, skilled in the way of sails and swift vessels, would grant him passage. A crew would be called, a ship would be launched, but first they asked him to tell his tale. Who was he? Where had he wandered? What had he seen? And so, with the firelight flickering across his face and the murmurs of the court falling silent, Odysseus finally gave his name, the name that had brought down Troy, the name that the gods had hunted, the name that still carried the scent of blood and salt. He said, I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca, and this is the story of my return. The hall of Alcinous grew quiet as the name Odysseus filled the air. It was a name that had lived in the mouths of bards and travellers, whispered in foreign marketplaces, and carried across oceans by wind and rumour. Some had spoken it with reverence, others with fear, others still with disbelief, wondering if the man behind it had become more myth than memory. But here he stood, cloaked in the firelight, eyes lined with salt and years, hands that had once gripped spears and now curled around a cup of wine. The court leaned forward, not with hunger, but with the reverence given to an old song sung anew by the man who first lived it. Odysseus drew a long breath. He looked not at the faces of the king and queen, nor at the servants standing still as statues along the walls, nor even at Nausicaa, who sat like a shadow among the listening. His eyes saw further. They travelled through the smoke of the hearth fire, through the painted rafters of the hall, through the distant blackness where stars drifted above seas he had crossed too many times. He saw again the walls of Troy, the broken gates, the flames rising like a final curse. He saw the Trojan horse, dark and still in the moonlight, a gift not from the gods, but from his own cunning. And so he began. He spoke of Troy, not with pride but with weariness, of the 10 years of siege, of the grief that sat heavy even in victory, of men who had grown old in armor and died before they ever saw their homes again. He told them of the gods who fought beside them and against them, gods whose favor shifted like sand in the wind, gods who could not agree among themselves whether men should suffer or be spared. And when Troy finally fell, when its towers crumbled and its people screamed beneath the fire, it should have been the end. But for Odysseus, it was only the beginning. When the final word of his story had been spoken, the hall remained still. The fire crackled. The torches sputtered low on the walls. No one moved to speak, not even the king or the queen. It was not silence born of uncertainty or confusion, but the kind that settles when something ancient has been unearthed and all present feel the weight of it pressing gently on their bones. The Phaeacians were a people of ships and sails, masters of calm waters and clever crafts, but few among them had ever heard a tale such as this, and none had ever looked into the eyes of a man who had lived it and returned with the voice to tell it whole. King Alcinius, regal and broad-shouldered, finally stood. He looked at Odysseus not with the gaze of a ruler judging a guest, but with something nearer to reverence. He spoke not of punishment or repayment, not of caution or warning, but only of honor. He said that no man who had suffered so deeply and endured so long should wait another day to see his home again. He called for his captains, for his craftsmen, for the finest ship in his fleet to be prepared with haste. Supplies would be laid aboard, a crew would be chosen, and Odysseus would sail before the next sunrise. He would not lift an oar, nor hold a rope. He would rest, while others labored. It was a gift, but more than that, it was a recognition. Even a stranger, once welcomed and known, became sacred under the laws of their house. That night, a final feast was held. The singers came, their fingers dancing along lyres carved from golden wood. The bard Demodocus was brought forward again, and he sang of Troy, of heroes whose names still echoed in the halls of the gods. He sang of Achilles, of Hector, of the fire that swallowed towers and the weeping that followed. But he did not name Odysseus in his verses. He did not need to. The man sat among them, quiet and pale in the torchlight, his shadow long behind him. It was enough that he was there, a man who had become a story and then somehow stepped free of it. Queen Arete pressed gifts into his hands, a cloak embroidered with silver thread, a chest of bronze filled with treasures that shone like starlight. She kissed his brow as a mother might, and whispered something only he could hear. Nausicaa said little, but her eyes held the weight of a farewell. She dared not speak aloud. He met her gaze only once, and when he did, he offered the faintest smile, small and sad and grateful all at once. When dawn came, the harbor was quiet. The ship stood ready, its hull curved like a swan's neck, its sail furled but eager. Odysseus walked slowly to the vessel, his limbs still stiff, but his heart braced for something he had not dared to feel in many years: hope. The sailors welcomed him without ceremony, only quiet nods and firm hands helping him aboard. He sat at the stern, wrapped in the cloak Arete had given him, his eyes fixed on the sea that stretched before him. He said nothing. There were no final speeches, no vows, no promises. The anchor was drawn. The wind filled the sail. The ship glided from the harbor like a dream slipping into the edges of sleep. The sea was calm. The gods, for once, said nothing, and as the sun lifted higher into the sky, Odysseus, king of Ithaca, closed his eyes. He slept not as a man hunted by gods and monsters, but as a man who had earned rest. The sailors rowed in silence. The ship moved swift as thought. The homeland he had lost and found again in dreams drew nearer with every breath of wind. The journey was not yet done, but at last the worst of it lay behind him. And ahead, at the end of the world he had circled for so many bitter years, his home waited beneath a pale sky and the rustle of olive trees. The ship sliced through the waves like a knife through soft linen, silent and steady, carried not by the straining of men's backs, but by the will of the gods who had at last grown weary of tormenting him. The sea lay still beneath a sky the colour of polished stone, pale and endless. Odysseus did not wake. He lay at the stern, his hands folded over his chest, his head resting on the cloak Queen Areta had wrapped about him, and he did not stir. His breath came slow and deep, the sleep of a man who had passed through fire and frost, who had wept in secret and screamed without sound, who had lost more than he could count, and had not yet dared to reckon what remained. He did not dream. His mind, long tormented by visions of monsters and storms, had gone quiet. No images came to trouble him, no voices, only the peace of darkness. The Phaeacian sailors did not speak as they rowed. They had seen enough in their lifetimes to know when a journey was sacred. This man was not merely a traveller. He was a vessel of something older than oaths, a figure pulled from the scrolls of myth to walk once more among men. When Ithaca rose on the horizon, a green spine emerging from the breast of the sea, they did not cheer. They only lowered their oars and let the tide draw them closer. The harbour was empty, as if the island itself knew to hush its breath. The cliffs watched in silence. The trees stood still. The water whispered against the hull, and not a gull cried out. It was not the return of a man. It was the return of a shadow. They brought the ship to shore beneath the cover of twilight. Odysseus still slept, unmoved by the slowing of the sea or the change in the wind. The sailors lifted him gently from the vessel, as one might carry a sleeping child or the body of a fallen king. They placed him on the sand, with the chest of gifts beside him and the cloak still wrapped about his shoulders. Then they returned to the ship and departed, their task fulfilled, their oaths complete. None remained to see the god's vengeance fall. For Poseidon had not forgotten. Even in his silence, the sea god had watched, and when the ship that had carried Odysseus reached the open sea once more, swift and proud and gliding like a swan across the deep, he struck. With a glance, he turned it to stone. The prow froze first, then the deck, then the sail, all hardening into pale grey rock. The sailors, frozen mid-motion, became statues of salt and grief, caught forever in their final act of mercy. The ship sank beneath the waves, not as wreckage, but as a monument, a reminder that no kindness toward the son of Laertes would go unpunished. Odysseus knew none of this. He awoke alone on the shore of his homeland. The smell of the earth and the sound of cicadas, familiar and strange, all at once. He sat up slowly, his body aching from stillness, and looked around. The olive trees rustled in the breeze. The hills rose behind him, green and quiet. The shepherd's path wound down to the bay, overgrown with thistle and thyme. It was Ithaca, but not the Ithaca he remembered. Years had passed. Time had pulled gently at the corners of his kingdom, worn the stones, thickened the vines, yet it remained. It had waited for him. But even now, he could not rise and walk openly into his halls. He was not yet a king. He was a stranger on his own soil, a ghost among the living. His house was no longer his alone. Suitors feasted in his halls, men fat with arrogance and drunk on his wine, wooing his wife and mocking his name. His son had grown without his guidance. His servants had lived without his command. His queen, faithful or not, still held her court. And if he returned as he was now, ragged and unknown, they would not bow, they would laugh. So he wrapped the cloak tighter about himself and took to the hills, leaving the gifts hidden in a cave beneath the watchful gaze of the gods. There, among the wild goats and wind-scoured stones, he met a man tending his sheep, a figure gnarled with age and calloused by labour, but strong still. And when the man spoke, it was with the voice of someone who had once called Odysseus master. It was Eumaeus, the swineherd. Odysseus did not reveal himself, not yet. He watched and listened, weighing the years in every word. In the small hut where Eumaeus lived, with smoke curling through the thatch and the scent of stew hanging in the air, he sat and ate in silence. It was a humble place, but it felt more like home than any palace had in years. The king had returned, but the reckoning had not yet begun. The hut was low and weathered, its walls patched with branches and hardened clay, its roof sagging beneath the weight of a dozen winters. Smoke seeped from a narrow hole at the top, the kind that stung the eyes but warmed the bones. Inside, the world shrank to firelight and the clink of wooden bowls. Eumaeus, the old swineherd, moved with the tired grace of a man who had known both servitude and pride, who had held fast to his duty, even as time forgot to reward him. He spoke often, not with boast or bitterness, but with the slow voice of someone who had been left with silence for too long. He spoke of Ithaca, of the suitors who infested the palace like rats in a granary, who feasted while the queen waited, who laughed while the people whispered. He spoke of Penelope, and how she still held her loom and her grief with the same stubbornness, weaving by day, unravelling by night, keeping her vows with thread. He spoke of Telemachus, who had left to seek word of his father, full of fire, but walking into the world like a lamb among wolves. Odysseus listened. He kept his name behind his teeth, like a blade hidden beneath a cloak. He nodded, asked questions like a beggar curious about royal gossip, and the more he heard, the more a slow fury rose in his chest. Not the wild rage of the battlefield or the storm-tossed shipwreck, but the cold, patient wrath of a man who had endured too much to die quietly. His house had become a stranger's hall. His people lived beneath the shadow of thieves. His son, untried and outnumbered, wandered through kingdoms seeking a ghost, and yet here, in this smoke-stung hut, loyalty remained. Eumaeus had not bent the knee to those who came to feast on what was not theirs. He had guarded the flocks, honoured the memory of his king, and waited. That night, as the wind howled through the olive trees and the fire crackled low, Odysseus spoke to the gods, not loudly, not with prayer, but in the quiet between breaths. He named them. Athena, who had followed him through every shattered shore. Zeus, whose thunder had both cursed and saved, Poseidon, whose hatred had shaped the very years of his journey. He named them not to praise or to beg, but simply to be heard. If they still watched, they would see him now, not as the weeping man on Calypso's shore, not as the broken sailor lashed to a splintered raft, but as the wolf who had returned to his den and found it overrun. In the days that followed, Telemachus returned. Athena herself guided him home through seas that had once turned against him, and brought him to Eumaeus's hut as the sun set behind the hills. Father and son stood beneath the olive trees, one with shoulders weighed down by the years, the other with the restless fire of youth, still untempered by blood. They did not know each other, not truly. The boy had been a child when the ships left for Troy. The man had become a myth, whispered in longing and half-remembered songs. But when their eyes met, when words passed between them, truth rose like a flame long buried beneath ash. Odysseus revealed himself, not with grand speech, not with tears, but by lifting his disguise, his voice steady and low, his face shadowed but proud. Telemachus stared, stunned by the gravity of what stood before him. He did not embrace his father. Not yet. He asked questions. He measured the man by his answers. And when the truth settled in his bones, when doubt fell away like a shattered scab, he fell into his father's arms, and for a brief moment, the years that had torn them apart seemed to vanish. Plans began to form. The suitors still sat fat and careless in the palace halls, believing their dominion unchallenged. They did not know that the king had returned. They did not know that the sun had become a man. They did not know that the gods, silent for so long, had begun to watch closely once again. Odysseus would not return to his home with trumpets or banners. He would return like a storm crawling over calm waters. He would wear the face of a beggar and carry no sword. He would walk through the doors of his own house as a shadow, as a whisper, as a reckoning long denied. And when the moment came, when truth would be revealed and names reclaimed, it would not be done with mercy. It would be done with the quiet, final justice of a king who had come home. The palace of Ithaca stood atop its rise, quiet in the early morning, a place of ancient stone and tired beauty. Vines crept along its outer walls. The great doors, carved with tales of gods and beasts, no longer guarded the honor they once did. Within, the halls echoed, not with the laughter of a king's household, but with the clatter of strangers feasting. The suitors had taken it for their own, grown bold in the absence of the rightful master. They lounged on couches meant for nobler men, spilled wine across woven rugs, shouted orders to servants who once served with pride, and mocked the name of Odysseus, as if he were nothing more than a tale to frighten children. The queen's weaving room had become a place of whispers and strategy. The boy Telemachus was watched but not feared. And Penelope, the queen with iron in her spine and mourning in her eyes, moved like a ghost wrapped in silks. They believed the king would never return. The gods had taken him. The sea had swallowed him. And so they drank and schemed and waited for the queen to choose one of them, to surrender her throne and her body in the same breath. None saw the gathering storm. Odysseus returned as a beggar. His back was bent, his face unshaven, his clothes stained with ash. Even his voice had changed, roughened by years of screaming into the wind. None recognized him as he entered the hall. None bowed. They sneered and shoved, tossing scraps of meat and insults as if he were a stray dog sniffing at the edge of their feast. But he watched. He memorized faces. He counted the blades they carried and the distance between them. He marked who laughed and who stayed silent. He learned the measure of his enemies with the patience of a hunter preparing the last shot. Telemachus played his part. The son, who had once wandered the world seeking news of a father, now sat beside the very man, saying nothing. His eyes held the secret, but he betrayed nothing in word or tone. He waited as Odysseus waited. Even the gods held their breath. Penelope remained distant. She watched the beggar with narrowed eyes, her heart stirring in strange ways. Something in his posture, something in his silence. But still, she did not ask. She dared not. Hope had been a cruel companion, and she had learned to mistrust its voice. At last, the moment arrived. It came not with a sword drawn, but with a test. Penelope brought forth the bow, the great bow of Odysseus, curved and polished, carved from horn and strung with the sinew of giants. None among the suitors could string it. One by one they failed. Their arms trembled, their pride cracked. They laughed to mask their shame, and then the beggar stepped forward. Mockery greeted him, shouts and curses, but Penelope, veiled and still, gave her silent consent. Telemachus cleared the space around him, and Odysseus took the bow. He strung it not with effort, but with memory. His fingers knew its shape, his shoulders remembered the pull. The string sang like an old song, long forbidden. He notched an arrow. He took aim. He fired. The shaft split the air like a knife and buried itself in the target with a thud that silenced the hall. Then he spoke. His voice rang across the room, clear and unshaking, stripped of disguise. He named himself. He claimed his house. He called out the suitors by name and named their crimes one by one. And before the echoes had faded, he fired again. The first man fell with an arrow in his throat. Panic erupted, but the doors had been barred. The suitors reached for their swords, but Telemachus had hidden them. Odysseus moved like the war god himself, loosing arrow after arrow, each one a judgment passed. Telemachus stood at his side. The swineherd Eumaeus joined them, and so too did Philoetius the cowherd, each man faithful, each man silent and fierce. Blood painted the stone, screams echoed against the marble. Men who had mocked the name of Odysseus now begged it for mercy. He gave none, not after the years lost, not after the halls defiled, not after the throne stolen and the heart of his queen wounded for so long. It was not vengeance, it was balance, a reckoning long overdue. When the final body fell, when the silence returned and the torches flickered once more in quiet rhythm, Odysseus stood alone in the center of the hall. The bow hung in his hand. His eyes burned with the cold fire of a man who had waited too long for justice. Around him, the sons of nobility lay broken. The tables were overturned. The house smelled of blood and ash. And still, he did not weep. The slaughter had ended. The bodies of the suitors lay sprawled across the stone floor like fallen deer in a sacred grove, their wine-stained cloaks stiff with blood, their open mouths silent at last. The fire still burned in the hearth. the same fire that had once warmed royal feasts and now glowed upon the wreckage of treachery and justice. Odysseus stood in the quiet, his chest rising slowly, the bow still clutched in one hand. He had spoken no words since the final arrow flew. The cries had died down, the clatter of panic had faded, and only the soft shuffle of Eumaeus gathering the weapons of the dead disturbed the stillness. Telemachus, stained with the blood of men who had stolen his childhood, stood beside his father, his shoulders squared, his eyes no longer those of a boy. And yet, even now, Odysseus was not whole. Penelope remained apart. Somewhere in the palace, she waited, her loom abandoned, her thoughts a knot of hope and disbelief. Word had reached her, brought by trembling servants, but she did not run to the hall. She did not faint with joy. She stood in the shadows, silent as the stone walls, her fingers twisted in her veil. For 20 years she had dreamed of his return, and now, a stranger in beggar's rags, claimed to be the man she had buried in her mind long ago. She had been betrayed by hope before. She would not be deceived by it again. Odysseus washed the blood from his hands and cast off the garments of a beggar. Athena came to him in that moment, unseen by mortal eyes, and touched his shoulders. His back straightened. His skin took on the glow of youth. His beard darkened. The weariness of a decade at sea fell from him like a shroud. And when he stood in the queen's chamber, he looked as he had when he left for Troy, proud and tall, with the same hard line to his jaw and the same storm behind his eyes. But Penelope did not smile. She studied him the way a sculptor studies a block of marble, looking for the shape hidden within. She did not rush to embrace him. She asked questions. She measured his words. Her silence was not coldness. It was armor, built over years of uncertainty. She had held the kingdom together with thread and will, had outwitted liars and silenced cowards, had raised a son alone and kept her dignity sharp as a blade. She would not fall into a man's arms simply because he knew the right name. And so she tested him. She ordered her servants to move the marriage bed, the one she and Odysseus had shared long ago, and place it outside the bridal chamber, a simple command, but one that no impostor could pass. At the mention of the bed, Odysseus stiffened. He spoke at once, his voice dark with memory. That bed, he said, could not be moved. He had built it himself from the trunk of an olive tree, rooted deep into the earth. He had carved the room around it, shaping their life together into the stone and wood of their home. It was immovable, unless someone had severed the tree, hacked at their very bond. At that, Penelope wept. She crossed the room and took him in her arms, not as a queen greeting a king, but as a wife reclaiming a husband. The years between them collapsed like dry leaves. They stood together, not as strangers, not as ghosts, but as the man and woman who had once begun their story with a single glance and had now ended a war with a single truth. That night, they returned to the olive bed. They spoke little. There were too many words, too many stories, too many scars to name. Instead, they lay side by side, the silence between them not empty but full. They had lost years. They had lost friends. They had nearly lost each other, but they had endured. The gods had tested them. The sea had scattered them. Time had tried to erase them. But in the end, they had returned to the place where it all began. And as Ithaca slept, beneath the moonlight that silvered the olive trees and the hills that had waited so patiently, the king and queen were whole once more. And that, dear listener, is the end. Sleep well. Good night.